Hey there, comrades. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We have a new guest in the library this week, our most excellent fellow podcaster, fellow psychoanalytic derelict, fellow theory nerd, and just all-around great comrade. Comrade Jared, one of the show's patrons, is coming on this week to help us tackle, for the first time, a huge influence on my own thinking and learning of Marxism as a method, the one, the only, Big Daddy David Harvey. Comrade Jared reached out and suggested this as a possible show episode for us to do, and little did he know, he made me an offer that I couldn't refuse, because we've been wanting to do David Harvey for a very long time. And I'm very happy that we get to take a quick breather from all the psychoanalytic stuff, although there's going to be a good bit of that too, because as I mentioned, Comrade Jared is a fellow psychoanalytic derelict. But we're going to look at Harvey's approach to Marxism as a method, his different ways of teaching and thinking about Marxism, different ways to understand capitalism. We're going to talk about the economic reason within the capitalist system and the madness that it leads to. We're going to talk about accelerationism, the law of surplus value, how value is created, and all sorts of other good stuff. This one is a hell of a lot of fun, and I'm very excited we get to bring this one to you. And I'm already excited for Comrade Jared to come back on for another episode in the future. Before we jump in, remember that if you would like to join Comrade Jared and the rest of us on not only our Discord server where you can shitpost, share memes, talk about episodes, debate things, but also our new Red Library Cinema movie nights that we do every Tuesday night during the COVID-19 pandemic apocalypse, remember to become a patron for as little as $1 a month, and that usually breaks down to $0.25 an episode, sometimes more. You get access to all of that stuff along with our back catalog of patron exclusive episodes, which I think we're about to release number 9. We're still working up to our goal of getting 50 patrons for the show, and we are getting real close. So, if you're new or you're an old listener and you really like what we're doing, hey, throw us a buck. That money goes to pay for the show's production costs, to get the show distributed through all the various podcast catcher apps, but we're also using it to put back into the work that we're doing, to buy new equipment, to buy books that we read and then do on future episodes, especially some of those that are harder to find, and all sorts of other good stuff. Remember, if you're listening on iTunes, please subscribe and also give us one of those star reviews. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. I'm trying to tweet more and trying to mix it up so it's a good blend of legit theoretical musings, quotes, but also a whole lot of shitposting too. And in general, just keep sharing the show around. And we just really hope y'all love what we do here, because we love making it for you. All right, without further ado, here we go. Me and Comrade Jared talking about David Harvey's Marx, Capital, and the Madness of Economic Reason. We'll see you back here afterwards, comrades. What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library. I'm here with an amazing, excellent new guest in the library, and I will let them introduce themselves because I don't want to steal their thunder. So say hi to everybody.
Not much thunder to steal here, Adam, but I'm Jared Elwert. You and I met through a couple of different things. I messaged you about the What is Sex podcast episode that you did a little while ago, and we also have a mutual friend, Comrade Neil, who does the From 78 podcast. So we've made a couple different connections in a couple different ways that were kind of surprising. So that's pretty cool. I'm also a social worker, much like you, although I think I've gotten the impression that I'm in a different subfield or whatever of social work. What's more interesting to me for my own work is I'm really into psychoanalysis, much like Comrade Neil, much like yourself. So I do that as well as doing social work in a different setting. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. I also wanted to point out, you had asked me to mention this briefly, that Comrade Neil, who does the From 78 podcast, he and I do another podcast together called the Inform podcast. So if anybody else is interested in diving into psychoanalysis a little bit more and from a clinical perspective, that's sort of the focus of our podcast there. We had talked about it for a long time, actually, maybe a year or two ago, I don't know, about how much we like the Why Theory podcast. And the more we talked about it, the more we thought, I wish there was a podcast like this, but from a clinical perspective rather than a cultural, political, etc. perspective. Not that that isn't great, but he and I are both clinicians. So eventually we decided, let's just do it ourselves. And now we do it. We've released 3 episodes so far, and I think we plan on doing it for as long as we can. So
I'm going to place an authoritarian demand on all Red Library listeners to go check out the Informed podcast because it is incredibly good. Y'all's episode on Actually What is Sex by Zupancic I thought was excellent and is such a cool, I think, complement or just like different approach that y'all take because of the actual sort of analyst kind of perspective on the work. Because I think for Red Library, like our sort of mix of, I think, personalities and characters and, you know, zany ass shit that we talk about, I think we sort of probably lean a little bit more on like the cultural political side with some aspects of the actual like clinical practice piece. But I just thought it was super great to hear y'all's perspective on it. And also the last episode you did on The Weird and the Eerie by Mark Fisher, which is a book that I love. Big ups to my main man Fisher, wherever he is out there in the matrix and the ether. I thought that episode was really phenomenal and discussing a work that not really anyone talks about. So highly, highly recommend the Informed podcast.
Yeah, if you're stuck in quarantine and you're looking for something really good, but really fun and easy to read at the same time, Weird and the Eerie by Mark Fisher, like it's outstanding. I could read that once a week for the rest of my life and still find really fun stuff to get out of it. It's awesome.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, since we're going to talk about Fisher a little bit, I know because I've you know, been able to peek at your notes. Have you read, I think it was his PhD dissertation on Gothic materialism?
I don't think so. You're not talking about the Vampire Castle, are you?
No, it's not that. I'll actually send you a PDF after we record today because it is really, really phenomenal. It's also like way more dense and kind of theoretical than some of his later works like Capitalist Realism and The Weird and the Eerie. You can tell he's definitely coming out of that group where he was still like very much associated with Nick Land and some of those other thinkers at the time. So I think the writing style is a little bit different and it's not quite as like refined, obviously. It's his like PhD thesis, but it is phenomenal. Also, he has a discussion about In the Mouth of Madness, the John Carpenter film, in there that is like one of my favorite things I've read in I don't even know how long. So I'll make sure I send you a copy of it.
Yeah, for sure. Always looking for stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely good quarantine reading. I mean, you know, to some degree, it might just reinforce our sense of nihilistic existential despair, but, you know, I'll send it to you anyway. Have fun.
You got to push into that anyway, right? You got to do some pushing into the nihilism.
That's right. I'm all about lean in nihilism on this show. I guess we could probably bullshit all day. Do you mind if I call you Comrade Jared? Because, you know, everyone's Comrade on the show.
Yeah, man. I'm here, aren't I?
You are here. I basically am saying this where it's like it's a false choice I'm presenting you as if you could say no, like, because I'm going to call you Comrade Jared either way. But anyway, let's share with listeners what you're here to lead us through a discussion of today.
Yeah, sure. We're talking about a book by David Harvey. It's called Marx, Capital, and the Madness of Economic Reason. David Harvey is, if I'm not mistaken, he's a sociologist, right? I think he's a professor of sociology in the United States, and he's been doing lectures on Marx where he teaches for 30, 40 years at this point. I'm not exactly sure how long, but a very long time. And it's very clear from everything that he's read that he knows his shit, like back to front. And it's outstanding. Reading him commenting on Marx I read this before I ever even started on trying to read Capital, and it made it so much easier for me that it blew me away. It's an outstanding read. So if you're looking for more quarantine reading, this is a good one, especially if, like myself, economics isn't necessarily your strong suit, which for me it is not, but this book makes it extraordinarily clear. And what makes it even a little bit more interesting, I think, is that it's not just an analysis of Marx's Capital and the Grundrisse and stuff like that, but he takes those ideas, looks at what Marx has been right about so far, what he's been totally wrong about so far, and how it's still relevant, because I think it very much is still relevant today. But a lot of people have this impression, a lot like I have this thought about Sigmund Freud as well, that a lot of people think, oh, he wrote that hundreds of years, well, not hundreds for Freud, but, you know, a long ass time ago.
Yeah,
and,
back in the day.
And so now it's got no value.
Yeah.
But I think that's totally incorrect. So that's this book.
Well, I have to tell you, whenever we were talking about a possible episode for you to do, I feel like I should also just acknowledge to everyone that you are also a Red Library patron. So I really love, like, whenever people become patrons of the show, and it isn't just like, oh, like, you know, you just contribute and like help support the show. It's also like, hey, like, what are you reading? Come on, and let's just talk about this book, you know, because we don't have time to read everything. So it feels like a very collectivist sort of approach to podcasting. I feel like that's what we're trying to do. So just, you know, shout out to all of our other patrons. Don't be surprised if, like, you tell me you read a book and I'm like, oh, well, now you have to come on the show and discuss it. But I think what I'm super excited about whenever you suggested this is that, David Harvey is, I would easily say, kind of a foundational Marxist thinker and educator in the world for the last, like you said, like 30, 40 years. And for some reason, it's just now dawning on me, like, I don't know why we haven't done a David Harvey book yet, considering the relevance and the impact that he's had on like updating and sort of translating Marxist ideas and some of the basic sort of political economic critique of Marxism into something I think that, is living and breathing for people now. I mean, to me, like this was absolutely like the perfect book to do. And it's also very relevant because this is also like right in the middle of this huge psychoanalysis deep dive that we're doing on the show. And so I think this is going to be a nice sort of complement to that too.
Yeah, I'm going to try my best to not rehash a bunch of points that you've already gone over and take this from a different perspective, but you can see a lot of where those psychoanalytic arguments come in to this book if you're looking for them anyway.
So tell me, Jared, prior to reading this book, what was your familiarity with Harvey? Had you read anything else, or had you like gone through his Capital reading series or his podcast or like YouTube videos? Because those are really famous too.
This was the first introduction that I had to David Harvey. I hadn't read anything, seen anything before him, but actually Comrade Neil recommended this book in particular to me a couple of years ago. So I picked it up and read it. And then I started picking up some of his other things. Like you mentioned the book where he goes through Capital, and it's been a long time since I read it now, but where he specifically goes through Capital and provides his commentary on it. And I've read that one, but it's been a little while. And I've watched some of his stuff on YouTube as well.
Yeah, I'll probably drop some links in the show notes for people. We've had requests to do like a Capital reading series, and I just blatantly tell people, no, we're not doing that. And the reason why is because David Harvey has done a Capital reading series on In-Depth in Volume 1 and Volumes 2 and 3. And honestly, I'm like, I'm not doing a Capital reading series on the show because you should just go listen to David Harvey do it, because it's like way better than anything we would do. But I'm going to make sure if anyone hasn't listened to those, that those will get posted in the show notes, because those are really phenomenal. Those like changed my whole understanding of not only Capital, but just Marx's method in general. And so those are still, I think, some of the best things in the world to listen to if you're interested in more of the like political economic side of Marxist thinking and theorizing, for sure.
Yeah, it's something else that he does in this book in particular, and if I'm remembering right, in his video and lecture series as well, is look at the structure of Marx's arguments, which I found really illuminating. Yeah, really illuminating.
Yeah, he is really amazing about that. And I think that's because he's been teaching the book for like 40 years. And so he can read it so many different ways. And he's been through so many different periods of different sort of ebbs and flows of different like particular frameworks of like theoretical analysis that, it's like he can read it one way. And then the next second, he'll be reading it through this sort of like post-structuralist lens, like a la Derrida, and like has a completely different view on it. And it's just phenomenal. And I mean, yeah, it's just listen to that shit. I mean, what are you doing? Actually, stop listening to this episode. Listen to all 40 hours of David Harvey talk about Capital and then come back.
It'll be worth your time. It sounds like a lot, but it's a fun 40 hours.
I mean, we're in a quarantine for the foreseeable future, so there's a better time than the present. So,
right. What else have you got to do?
That's true. Well,
so do you want to get started on diving in on stuff here?
I think we should. I have a feeling we got a lot to go over. So I usually like to start anytime we're leading a book, because the idea is that for Red Library, we want to try to basically make the core arguments and concepts really relatable and understandable to listeners. So, ideally they could go read the book. And I mean, that's awesome if they do. We're not going to hate on anybody if they go read the book. But we also want people to come away with a really clear idea of like what the core sort of arguments of the book are, like what its analysis is really all about. And I always like to ask, like prior to us jumping into the material, so you reading this book a couple of times, doing analysis, having some familiarity with Harvey's work, so what would you say are like the main points that you find really relevant for you thinking about this politically or socially or however you want to think about it? Yeah, what do you really take from this book, or what do you really find most useful about it?
The very, very first thing that I take out of this is the system of value, or sorry, not the system, the concept of value as constantly being in motion. He uses the hydrological system of rain falls from the clouds, it falls into the rivers where it flows into the ocean, and like there's a cyclical nature to it where it's ebbing and flowing constantly. And he uses that same sort of idea to describe the flow of capital throughout the capitalist system. And it's extraordinarily illuminating. It's a simple way to think about it, but a simple way that I think is valuable in its simplicity. Because otherwise, if you try to think about it strictly in terms of like money and value and all these really highly technical terms, you're bound to get lost, especially at first. But if you think about it as the system of weather, it's a lot easier to keep track of and understand just how constitutive the nature of motion is to the capitalist system.
Yeah, I think that is such a phenomenal place to start. And I remember that's what really grabbed me about Harvey's particular way of teaching Capital and like Marx's method, is that capitalism has to be understood as a total system. And it has to be understood, yeah, exactly, as a total system that's constantly in motion. The only way that capitalism continues to function, and it's almost like it constantly has to be juggling itself in the air. And the second that that motion stops is usually the second that a crisis arises, you know, sort of a slump in consumption or like a slump in production and vice versa. And so I think the idea of thinking about it as a weather system, to me, again, is just a great example of why Harvey is such a master educator about Marxist theorizing, is because, you know, if you were to just read Das Kapital, like volume 1, and you would probably read a chapter. I mean, most people do read a chapter or two, and you're like, what the fuck is this? And then usually you throw it down, and then you go read, like, you know, Lenin usually, and then maybe you'll come back to Marx, but maybe not. So I think starting from a way to conceptualize capitalism as a total system, and, you know, maybe using something like a weather system as an analog to it, to me is, I think it's usually the most helpful place to start, to get a sense of like what is actually being talked about here. Like, what are we really trying to understand, or what's the best way into this?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's essential. It's an essential way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then another essential thing that I think you need to pull out from the very beginning is that value, which is the entire, what am I trying to say? A concept that runs throughout the entire book. Value never goes away, but value is always created socially. It's really easy to lose track of that fact, but David Harvey makes that immediately clear from the very beginning, that in Marx's conception, and I think Marx's conception is the right way to think about it this way, value is always created by the social nature of labor that goes into the commodity.
So let's unpack that a little bit. Have you listened to our Ernest Mandel series on an introduction to Marxist economic theory yet?
Yes, I have.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think one of the most important things to discuss is the way that we theorize where value comes from, and that there are a lot of different competing ways to think about it. So whenever you say that value is something that is social, or it's a socially created category, how would you understand like what typically is in opposition to that? Like, if we're not thinking about it as a socially constructed category, like how do you most often find that we do think about it?
If I were to ask somebody that I work with what makes something valuable, I think they would probably say the difficulty with which whatever it is the thing is made out of, whatever the difficulty acquiring the materials to make that thing is proportionate to the value. That's probably the most common competing theory of value that I hear.
So how would you typically respond to that if you were coming at it from more of this like Marxist, like social value sort of perspective?
Here's a really easy way to put it, I think, at least from the way that I think about it. If you think about something that's invaluable, something that has absolutely no value, you couldn't pay any amount of money for somebody to take it from you, or you couldn't pay somebody any amount of money to get it from them. Those kinds of things aren't typically made out of the most difficult to acquire materials that are possible. Like the drawings that my 1.5-year-old daughter has made, and when she's in daycare, nobody could ever pay me any amount of money that would make me feel like I should give them the drawing. Like, it's totally invaluable. It has nothing to do with the materials that it's made out of. All of it has to do with the social nature of the work that my 1.5-year-old put into doing something.
I think that's a really great example. Don't be surprised though if now you have a bunch of like very like money hungry capitalists who are going to try to create a market around your daughter's drawings.
They're really good drawings, I'll tell you what.
Have you seen the film Parasite yet?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, I don't want to give you too many spoilers, but there's a great scene where one of the main characters is looking at it looks like a very like abstract sort of self-portrait that this young child has done. And, and it's framed and it's up on the wall. And basically the sort of the turn in the film, or the really hilarious sort of reframing of this painting, is at first it's that, oh, is this painted by this like young artistic genius? And then as the film goes on, you realize that actually it's just a terrible painting, but because the family like places a certain value on it, like that's why they think it's, deserves to be framed. And it's like this work of great genius. But I think that art, to try to pull out some actual like theoretical point from all of that, I think that art like is such a fantastic place where you really do see the social nature of value and what we define as valuable, and how the market sort of like waxes and wanes based on like what certain people define as being socially valuable or not. I always felt like art was like one of the best places to really see where that social element really plays out.
Yeah, another good one I think is scientific knowledge and imagination. David Harvey makes that point in this book, where, at least in the way that Marx thinks about it, scientific knowledge isn't valuable. It doesn't fit inside of that social relational framework, but it can be given a price and it can be used to produce things that do have a social value. So that's another way to think about it. But art, I think you're right, is another great one.
I mean, the science example is like pretty fascinating as well. Great. So, I mean, any other like big points that jump out of like, this is why this book is like relevant and interesting and important for listeners to understand?
The other big thing that I think should be taken away from it is that, so in Marx's Capital, he defines, I think it's seven different moments that include things like technology, social relations, the relationship to nature, and a couple of different ones. And I think David Harvey makes a really good case that when you get stuck on just one of these moments as the point on which you're going to base a revolution or a revolutionary act, then it's not going to do the things that you would like it to do when you do them. So there has to be a consideration of more than just one perspective, one of these moments that Marx defines. Like I said at the very beginning, I'm trying not to take the strict psychoanalytic approach here, because I think that's a way to fall into that trap, to just take that one reading when there's a whole other reading here from David Harvey's sociological economic approach that is valuable.
Well, don't be surprised if I'm going to ask you to sort of like compare those throughout the time that we have. I'm really fascinated because I think that, I guess with any particular framework or any particular analytical approach, like the danger is always collapsing everything into that one approach. And so I think that's maybe kind of the challenge, and something I'm really glad you mentioned that, because even for our show, right, like it's like we might be doing a lot of psychoanalytic stuff at this point in Red Library sort of, like general intellectual sort of endeavor, whatever that is. And I also think it's important to remember that that isn't the only way that we think about capitalism and like revolutionary, like critical approaches to like economics and politics. It's like, it's really important, but it isn't the only one. And it's important to, like sort of have, I almost want to say an eclectic approach. I feel like I have a really eclectic approach. It's like I'll read Zupancic one day, and then the next day it's like I'm wanting to do an episode about Jacobo Arbenz and like the Guatemalan Revolution, because to me those feel like you have to have both of those. I think to have a truly sort of a framework that is capable of really understanding like the nature of capital, because I feel like I've been saying this a lot more lately, like whenever I'm being put on the spot. And actually Neil put me on the spot, and I'm really glad that he did this on our first Lost Horizons roundtable discussion, is just being asked, like, what do you think a revolution is? Or like, whenever you talk about wanting a revolution, like, what does that mean for you? Do we mean the same thing? And, I realize that more and more for me, and I think David Harvey is probably one of my biggest influences on this, is that, well, if that's what I'm in favor of, to me, it always seems like the first step is what Marx's first step was. I better understand capitalism if that's the thing that I'm opposing. And I think David Harvey is still one of the best people at giving you a way to understand what capitalism is in a very, very thorough and as easy to understand as possible way. And, as far as I'm concerned, he should be canonized by all Marxists because of that. So
yeah, he absolutely should. It's insane how clear he makes these arguments. And another thing that I like along that same vein about this book is that I think in a lot of different ways that you could read Marx, a lot of different avenues by which you could read Marx, people who write about economics or science and stuff like that are afraid to put themselves as subject into the book and sort of reveal, like, I'm not some objective entity reading Marx and strictly telling you what the words that he wrote on the page meant.
Yeah.
I'm a person who has thought about this in a different time period, in a different country, and blah, 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 blah. And David Harvey isn't afraid to write the word I, like I myself, David Harvey, am writing this perspective and these are my thoughts on it. I appreciate that a lot. It places him at the forefront. It's sort of, he confronts himself. Confronts is the wrong way. Puts himself on the spot, the way that you said that Comrade Neil did on your roundtable.
Yeah, and I think that's so important too. That sort of that reinsertion of subjectivity back into the like really strict objective quote unquote analysis of something like capitalism or like how a globalized economic system functions. And it's almost like you can't remove that, and so it's important to almost like dialectically like push into that as a way to, like, in some ways, like strengthen and push your analysis as far as it can go. It's like you don't do yourself any favors by trying to abstract out your own subjectivity from it. So, I mean, again, another reason why I have such respect and sort of admiration for what he does.
Yeah, and the way you put it there sort of brings me to one of the overarching points that I wanted to make about this book, about economics as being a big, gigantic, scary, air quotes, true science. Or like a pure science or something like that. And the way that it gets talked about and treated, at least in the discourses where I'm involved in it, it seems like people really have this idea that economics is a true science, like, I don't know, astrophysics or geology or something like that, that it's on that same level. And I think, first of all, I think that if you think about it even just a tiny little bit, you realize that that's not the case.
Yeah.
But then you can push into that, and David Harvey does that. David Harvey does that in this book, and I think you come out on the other side recognizing that it is absolutely not an objectively true, pure science. Economics isn't that. It's constantly influenced by a billion different factors that are changing over time. They don't remain constant. The time period in which Marx was writing was vastly different than what it is now. And the way that we think about the economy is different now than it was back then. And even throughout Marx's own life, his own thoughts changed on it. I think if economics was a pure science in that way, it would be a lot harder to have a changing perspective on it that changes so dramatically over time. You do see changes in the scientific tide, but a lot of things remain totally constant in those pure sciences that I don't think do in the economic sciences.
So I want to ask you two questions because I think that this is such a beautiful place to start. Also, I have to tell you, I know that you were a seasoned podcaster because of the way that you transitioned from what we were talking about into the first part of your notes. I saw you do that, and I just want to know. I see you, Comrade Jared. I see how skilled you were and how you did that.
Oh no, that's the gaze, Adam.
That is the
don't gaze
exactly.
at me here, Adam.
That's all right. We'll shut off our video feeds on our Zoom call. But then it's the voice, then it's the true, like the encroaching of the real through the voice instead. So anyway, sorry, that's a different route to get down. So I want to ask you two questions about this. I think this is a great place to start, and I'll separate them because I don't want to stack questions on each because they're different. So the first one, I'm curious, would you describe, at least through your reading of Harvey, would you say that economics is much more like a social science versus a sort of like true hard science?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. I would definitely call it a social science. We talked about how value is dictated by the social labor that's put into the product that comes at the end of labor. So I would definitely call it more of a social science than I would call it a true or hard or pure science.
Yeah, so obviously like much closer to sociology or psychology than it is to like astrophysics or something like that.
And I think economics itself as a field thinks that too, because you have subfields of economics like behavioral economics. I think there's a clear recognition there that it is not purely scientific in the like air quotes objective sense.
Okay, so that leads me to my second question, because I think that the way that we encounter economics, typically, let's say if you take like an economics 101 course, or the way that economics is discussed in like media and common sense understandings of how we encounter economics through the way that, the market is described, or like whether the Dow is up or the Dow is down, like day to day, right? I always remember having this feeling that economics is portrayed to me as if it was a hard science. Like this is describing natural laws of the universe. So I'm wondering for you, Like, how do you think about what the ideological function is of portraying itself, or people wanting to portray economics as a hard science, if in fact it's actually much more like a social science, where it's much more sort of like it's not clearly as objective as something like physics would be?
The way that it functions ideologically, oh man, you're really putting me on the spot here, Adam. So let me try to work this out on the fly as best as I can.
Yeah, go for it.
So presenting it as a true, hard, pure science, I think, first of all, makes it seem as if economics is external to us, like as if we don't have any participation in it, as if it's being imposed on us, and there's no way that we can fully mitigate that, if that makes any sense.
It makes total sense.
But okay, good. I'm glad we're on the same wavelength here. And I think that what that does by making it external is it functions to disallow people from thinking or believing that they have any revolutionary role in the changing of capitalism, or that they have any role in the perpetuation of capitalism, that they don't have any responsibility in how it's continuing to play out in all of the ways that it has gone poorly over the last several centuries.
Okay, so I think this is a really fascinating answer, because this is exactly where I really appreciate like having the psychoanalytic sort of perspective on this. Because I think sometimes whenever we think about the ideological function of portraying economics this way, it's usually this sort of argument about interests, like material interests, right? Like certain people, certain groups, i.e. capitalists, and people who benefit from capitalism, or at least psychologically are very invested in it. It's like we want it to continue, and we have to portray it this way. So precisely so it doesn't, we sort of minimize our ability to challenge it in a way. But I think the other piece that you just said that is really important is that it also sort of negates our own sense of responsibility for the exact system that we're participating in and continuing to allow to function the way that it does. And I think it's probably, for an analytically minded person, it's probably not a surprise why we skirt around that part of the critique, because everyone's implicated. Like, I'm implicated in capitalism continuing to function. You are. Like, fuck, Marx and Engels were whenever they were still alive and doing their work. I think it's a much harder thing for us to grapple with, to think about how, even as someone who calls themselves like a radical revolutionary leftist podcaster, derelict, whatever I am, that basically it's like I'm still somehow participating and allowing capitalism to continue.
Yeah, I'm talking into a Blue Yeti microphone right now. So obviously, I'm not free from implication here. And the purpose of making that point isn't like, oh, I've been implicated in capitalism and now I recognize that, so I might as well just lay down and die over it. Yeah. It's that I've been implicated in it, and it's only because I've been implicated in it and that I'm responsible for perpetuating it that I can do anything about it.
Sorry, I'm giving you my Stalinist claps that we give people on the show. I think that is such a beautiful point, is that it is only until we're fully implicated in the thing itself that we then have a point to stand on to figure out, okay, well, now what am I going to do? Like, I do have some agency in the system because my agency is what it's allowing it to continue in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another point that I wanted to make while we're in this economics as true science point is that a lot of people have this idea that capitalism is the best system for humans to partake in because it's the most natural system. It feeds our natural, like, competitive drives or something like that, something akin to that. I don't get the argument because I think it's fucking stupid, but I shouldn't say it that way. I think I do understand the argument. I just really fundamentally disagree with it, because I don't think capitalism is a completely natural state of economics for human beings, and I have two reasons for thinking that. Number one, capitalism itself as a system is always focused on the future. There's no endpoint. There's no horizon. Everything has to be kept beyond the horizon for capitalism. It has to always be generating new commodities, new ideas, and new ways of organizing labor, and on and on and on and on and on. And it can't envision a point where any of that stops. If it had that endpoint, I don't think it would be capitalism. Whereas nature itself can. It can. It has to be able to do that. It has to be able to envision a point where things end. I think most scientists agree that at some point, way down the line, obviously, but that at some point the Earth will not be here. It'll be consumed by the sun, and that'll be it, and it'll be gone. It has that endpoint already built into it, and so that's one of the reasons that I think capitalism is not natural. Sorry, I'm stumbling here a little bit.
No, you're doing great. This is such a great point, and this actually reminds me of one of the things that Harvey sort of utilizes in how he understands capitalism as a system that constantly has to be churning and in motion for it to function. So, the other thing about David Harvey that I remember being sort of surprised by, but I really love his perspective, is that he also was trained as a geographer. And so I think he has a very interesting way of thinking about space and time and how capitalism functions. And I remember this thing that he said about capitalism, especially in the Industrial Revolution, and as technological sort of revolutionary changes really allowed capitalism to sort of speed up its ability to valorize profits and basically to sort of basically cash in on the things that it's producing, is he said that in capitalism and with technological changes of transportation and mass communication technology, that space had been conquered by time. And the idea that these huge vast distances, 200 years ago that, would take years to exchange between them, now take days. And the way that time speeding up has conquered geographic spaces, and how that allows capitalism to sort of continue to speed up, but also as it speeds up, it sort of makes the system sort of more shaky and more prone to crisis and rupture. And to me, I think it seems like probably what we're going to keep coming back to is this sort of temporal piece about capitalism, and how you have to think about it as this thing that is moving through time and space to really understand how it works. And so, yeah, it's really interesting because in capitalism as well, even though you have to think about that temporal aspect, there's never the end point, because the end point is constantly what capital is trying to prevent from occurring. Everything in capitalism is about staving off crisis, because the idea is that at some point that crisis is going to crash everything. And so that's we have to pretend that doesn't exist, and everything is sort of a strategy almost to, in the logic of capital, to push it a little bit farther down the road, just so we don't have to think about it and we can still focus on short-term gains.
Let me ask you this. I tend to think of crisis as being built in and a necessary part of capitalism, but the way that you just put it, I wonder if maybe I'm hearing it differently than what you're saying, or if you disagree. I don't know.
So whether I think crisis is sort of inbuilt or not?
If it's inbuilt and a necessary part of capitalism continuing.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I absolutely do. I think that crisis is sort of a necessary consequence, or a necessary part of just the logic of capital as a system as it functions. I guess the reason I'm talking about it, sort of seeing it almost like it's displacing it further and further into the future, is I almost have this weird sense that it's kind of the logic of capital almost displacing or sort of projecting its own sort of weakness and crisis into sort of some point in the future, so it can almost sort of be in denial about its own pathology, I guess, if we're sort of wanting to analyze capitalism as if it was sitting, on the couch across from us. I think that's how I kind of think about it, is how capital tends to, and I think people who buy into the logic of capitalism, how we have to understand that crisis seems to be endemic, and it serves, I think, a very necessary purpose in capitalism, namely destruction of overproduction of goods, or sort of pushing people into the reserve labor force or whatever it is. But it's almost we have to also, I think, be in denial about how necessary it is for capitalism to continue.
Okay.
That could be complete garbage, sense. I'll be honest. I'm just sort of winging that on the spot as we're talking about it. So, I mean, don't at me on Twitter if you disagree with that analysis.
I won't at you. Maybe somebody else will, but I won't at you, because it makes sense to me. The endpoint crisis of capitalism is what I think is being constantly pushed into the future. And I think that's, you and I are on the same wavelength there, that the idea of it being over is constantly, you're right, projected as a fear and pushed off and pushed off and pushed off, even though crisis is still a totally inborn and necessary trait of the capitalist system itself.
Yeah, definitely. Very interesting comparison between that and the system of, socialism or communism or whatever, is that there is some idea that there's an endpoint. I feel like that's a fundamental distinction between the two different perspectives.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. The conception of the endpoint is what individuates a lot of different things. It's what am I trying to say here? I'm confusing my own argument as I'm putting it out there. I think in a lot of ways, the end point of things is what sort of retroactively defines their beginning and middle as well, if that makes any sense. When I say that, I'm thinking specifically of psychoanalysis, where the end point is conceived of as totally differently from that of other modalities of therapy. And not that it's, like necessarily better. It's the one that I prefer, but that doesn't mean that it's objectively some better thing. But its endpoint is defined vastly differently from other endpoints. And that tells you how the beginning and middle are going to go as you go through it.
Yeah. I just have to tell you, I'm really glad that we're doing this episode, because whenever someone comes on the show and they say, yeah, it's, the endpoint retroactively defines what the middle and the beginning is, I'm just like, yeah, that makes total sense. That means we're in good company. We're in good company today, comrade. So
Perfect. I need some good company. I don't have any, I shouldn't say any. I have limited company right now. So
yeah, no, I definitely vibrate on that wavelength myself. So I don't know, where do you want to go next? I feel like is there more you want to say about sort of the defining of capitalism as like natural, or somehow it's like the most natural system for the human species or whatnot?
I do have one other reason that I have for thinking that. I was going to save it, but you know what? Screw it. Let's just dive into it now. And I'm going to rehash a point of Todd McGowan's actually when I put this out there. But capitalism has this tendency to present us with objects as if those objects are going to finally be the object that fills up our lack, that fills up the missing piece that will finally make us whole. And obviously it doesn't do that. And the reason that it doesn't do that is because each subject within or without of capitalism is barbed, is pierced, separated by speech. And when we become barbed in that way, we begin to be able to place more into objects than is actually inside of them. This is the basis for Todd McGowan's whole book of Capitalism and Desire, that when we can put more into the object, then our psychic investment in capitalism and its commodities is far greater. Because every time you buy something, depending on what it is, I don't think food necessarily has the same thing. It can, but I don't think it necessarily does. But every time you buy something, you're investing in this idea that I have finally found the thing that's going to fill me back up again, that's going to make me whole again. So to bring this back to why I don't think that makes capitalism natural, I think that speech is the thing that separates humans from nature itself.
So the idea is that because like capitalism, especially I think our version of capitalism now, like fundamentally operates on accumulation, consumption of commodities, that the idea that in capitalism, like that commodities will somehow satisfy you, they are das Ding, right? They are the thing, right? That, if we could just capture those commodities, that then we would be whole. Capitalism has to operate on this principle, or sort of the fantasy that commodities will eventually do this for you. And so that makes us feel as if this like matches our own, I almost want to say like primordial experience of being human.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely the way that I'm thinking about it right now. And I think that is, at least in part, what I'm overarchingly aiming to do when I do work, is resituating people's relationships to the physical objects that they have in their life. And that takes form in a billion different ways, because people are attached differently to all of the different things that they have in their lives. But the staying power of capitalism, I really do think, is based, at least in part, on this psychic attachment we have to the commodities that are a result of capitalist production.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind too, and this is especially what I remember hearing as I grew up, definitely like much more right wing and having like debates and discussions about people who still identify with like more conservative right wing positions. This idea that like greed is natural, that human beings are inherently naturally greedy as like a fundamental defining aspect of the human species. I think the thing that is sort of always like it's never considered is that is also a retroactive definition, that you've taken the social conditions of capital as you find them and then basically retroactively define like what you think the universal is of being human as like based on that exact quality of the system, which is designed to perpetuate you being greedy to make sure that capitalism continues to function.
Yeah, it's very clearly the other way around. I think that's the wrong direction of the dialectical reversal to go.
Yeah, exactly.
You've reversed it the wrong way.
Yeah, it's like you've just reversed it the wrong way, bro. Just turn it around. So,
turn it the other way.
But I do think that's another way that, yeah, like this sort of way that capitalism ideologically has to, and maybe this is almost the case, I mean, this is maybe something to do on another episode, but, you know, whether in any sort of political economic system, the nature of ideology is to naturalize it as just being inherently part of what it is to be human. Like this system mirrors the most fundamental human nature that we have. And so that's why this is the best system. I don't know. Again, that's a huge thing to think about that, you know, in other sort of political economic arrangements besides capitalism. But I do think that it's pretty clear to me in capitalism that that's part of what's ideologically has to be done to sort of get us to invest in it.
I think that's clear. I definitely think that that's clear, that it has to present itself as totally natural. People buy into that argument all over the place.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. I've had conversations like this with a million different people because I love to talk about it, even though other people hate to talk about it. But
welcome to my show.
But I know, right? It's the bomb. I love that nobody likes to talk about this stuff.
That's why we have leftist podcasters.
Some niche audiences. Yeah, exactly. But no, that this idea that it's the most natural state is totally pervasive, and it's hard to combat that because when you think about it, or maybe when you don't think about it is the better way to put it, it does a very good job. The ideological functions extraordinarily well. It's done a great job, and that's why we've seen capitalism have the staying power that it does for as long as it has. It's presented that ideological argument very well, and people have bought into it. I mean, I probably didn't question the hold that the capitalist economic system had over me for 20 years, the first 20 years of my life. I mean, when you're a kid, it probably isn't supposed to cross your mind anyway, but in some ways it really does. And it had never even crossed my mind to think about it any other way for a long time.
I think the fact that we're socialized into it, and, you know, for most of our first part of our lives, like we're so deeply embedded in this sort of hegemonic ideology of naturalizing it. I think that's precisely where things like analysis and sort of different approaches of supplementing like a hardcore like political economic approach are so valuable, because, you know, it helps us understand how is it that we actually come to conceptualize ourselves as people, and how we understand the social world around us. And we have to like really kind of have a pretty nuanced perspective, or a nuanced analysis of how exactly that happens to really understand how to subvert it, I think. And maybe that's part of why, you know, the analytic piece to me is so important, is because we're also trying to figure out how to most effectively subvert, you know, the fact that we were all social. Like I always say this on the show, no one was born with like a copy of State and Revolution and like a hammer and sickle pacifier in their mouth that I know of. You know, and even if you were, you probably had to rebel against that, and then you hate like, you know, communism and socialism because of it. But I do think that that's sometimes like really underestimated, especially, you know, for me as someone who comes from like a very right-wing, like conservative sort of background, and then also, you know, does organizing work where you're most of the time talking to people who don't believe any of this shit that you do, and your goal is to try to help understand and like convince them, you know, that this is going to help them get what they want more than, you know, buying into the capitalist system. It's like, I think you have to reckon with that, yeah, like most of us have been deeply socialized and have never questioned these fundamental things we take as being natural parts of the universe. It's almost like, you know, you just see them as if they're gravity or thermodynamics. It's like, this is just the way the universe is. This is just the way people are. And it's, you know, being able to subvert that in a really like effective way, I think is really hard. But to me, I don't know, I find that the psychoanalytic perspective is like almost as necessary, if not more necessary, than like I can lay out the argument for like Marxist capital, you know? Yeah,
no, that's a really good way of putting it. I actually really like that you just brought up the fact that part of what you do is in the organizer role. I think that brings us really nicely to another huge point that I brought out of this, which is that of this book, I should say, which is that the capitalist system sort of requires over time that the individual become the focus of each individual rather than the commons. I don't know if that makes any sense outside of my brain. So let me try to say it again.
Go for it.
The individual capitalist subject can be focused on any number of different things, and it used to be much more focused on collectivizing, on, unionizing, on communities, on common space, and different things of that nature. And since that time, it has become more and more prominent that the individual itself has become more and more the focus of the capitalist subject's attention. Yeah, that's all I'll say about it for now, and then I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something you see pretty clearly in not just studying labor history and the sort of rise and then eventual destruction and decline of unions, but, this is the most, I think, common encounter with this argument is Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, of how, civil institutions and sort of neighborhood and community have been fundamentally destroyed, and now we're all alienated, atomized, like lonely individuals. And it's like, yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. Where you sort of place the cause of that, I think, is the real key. So I don't want to jump back to something that seems too different, but I was curious because I feel like, to me, this is something that showed up in your notes, and this is what I think a lot about in terms of organizing, but also the focus becoming increasingly on the capitalist subject as individual and not as a member of a community. I was wondering if you would talk about this piece in your notes about capitalism's penchant for deception, and I really love the idea of the necessity of deception in capitalism, because I don't think that's ever a way that we've talked about it on the show.
So I wrote that because as you go through this book, especially if you're taking the psychoanalytic approach that I have, there are even more avenues, but either way, there are a ton of avenues that that capitalism reveals itself as totally deceptive. And I made 7 different points on this. So the very first one that I think is probably the most fundamental is that the nature of surplus value is totally hidden from sight, and it's become more and more hidden from sight over time. So, you create surplus value when a laborer creates a commodity and gets back less from it than what the capitalist themselves is able to get in exchange for the commodity that the laborer has produced, right? That's where the surplus value comes from. And it used to be the case that a lot of the factories where that happened were located in the same country where it was happening. So in the United States, there used to be a lot more factories, right? And as time has gone on, all of those factories have moved outside of the country. So now there are almost no factories that an American just in their day-to-day life can peek their head in and see where the labor is happening that creates the surplus value that they're paying for when they go to the store and buy something. Mm-hmm. Now all of that is happening in different Asian and Latin American countries, and it is totally hidden from sight. And what makes it even more fascinating, I think, to me, is that even when you do think about it or recognize that that's what's going on, the way that I want to put it is that because it's so far away, even when you think about it, the distance that it has from you makes it really easy to disavow that it's happening at all, if that makes much sense.
Yeah, I think this is a crucial point about thinking of global supply chains and the chain of commodity production now, that the sort of most brutal physical form of violence within capitalism is so far removed geographically, spatially, from where you actually experience the purchasing and the sort of consumption of your commodities, that even if you can sort of abstractly understand it, that geographical space still makes the disavow so much easier. But I think the thing that everyone, and I think this is still an incredibly relevant thing to talk about, if you have a Mac or if you use an iPhone, to understand that you can almost guarantee that part of why you're able to have that computer or that piece of technology, I mean, it is built on child slave labor. There's just no other way to think about it. That, the coltan that goes into your technology was mined usually by horribly oppressed, brutalized young children in mines in, let's say, the Congo. So, one of the things that I wonder about is that I can understand that abstractly, but what would it be like if I knew personally one of those young kids who has to go into that mine every day? Would that change whether I still would decide to buy that iPhone or not? And I do wonder about that, that sort of, even though on a very abstract level, we can understand the sort of the just terrifying violence of the system that allows me to have the things that I want. If it's still so far removed from us, is it still, it almost allows us to then get out of that feeling of being responsible for the system, because I can say, well, I have an iPhone, but I bought fair trade coffee when I went to Whole Foods or whatever. It's does that somehow get us out of that feeling? And if we had to look at that young child in the face right before they walked into the mine, would that be a different experience?
I think you're probably right that it would be. And that's what I think makes it constitutive to capitalism itself. Like the locus of the surplus value has to be far removed from the people that are finally consuming it in order for it to continue working the way that it does. Because to use your example of having to lick the child that produced it, I don't think that would go over terribly well. Maybe it would. I have no idea. Or maybe if that is the way that it worked from the beginning, then it would be different than if it was imposed now. I don't know. I think there's probably a million different ways to think about it. But I do think it's clear that the process would be different in some way, shape, or form. I just don't know what that way, shape, or form would be.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about, too, did you ever read much Engels by chance?
I didn't, no.
I was thinking about the conditions of the working class in England. That book is incredible. I still think it's an absolutely like knee-shaking read to just sort of understand that, you know, even then, right, like in the early phases of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution in a place like Manchester, that even then you still had to remove the source of surplus value and like ghettoize it and like put it into these like brutal, you know, communities that were horribly impoverished, you know, rampant with disease and all this other stuff. But and it may be closer, you know, maybe on the other side of town, right, than where you're actually purchasing your textiles or whatever it might be. But it was still removed from you. And you think about the slave labor system in the U.S., right? It's like, it does seem like there's always this thing of like where you have to remove the brutality as far away as you can. And it's just that now, because of the, you know, mass communications and like transportation technologies, like we can move it further and further away and drive down wages even more. And we still can like, you know, have that H&M t-shirt 2 days from now after it was manufactured on that ship, you know, in the middle of the international waters, so it gets out of labor laws. I mean, you know, it's like in some ways I wonder if that's always been a constitutive feature of capitalism, like you're saying, is that you have to like remove that brutality of where surplus labor is coming from as much as possible.
You know, it's funny. One way that I see people argue against this idea, or maybe not argue against it, believe that they're subverting it, is by going to local stores and buying locally. Yeah. And, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not still participating in that brutally violent system in the same way. It can mean that you're not, or that to a degree you're not. But chances are, if you're buying from some local place, chances are pretty good that they're still participating in it to one degree or another. There's very limited ways of escaping that entire construction altogether. And in fact, I even wonder if there are any ways of completely escaping it.
You know, I think this is exactly where having a very dialectical approach is so crucial. And this comes back to something we started talking about with as well. I think that most people's response to that, and I think most people's reaction, is inherently a very reactionary sort of perspective, is to say, oh, wait a minute, I'm part of this system. This feels really terrible to have to think about me being implicated in this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to react and sort of try to like escape the system as much as possible. I'll buy local, you know, I'll only buy things that are fair trade. But I think inherently it's like a deeply sort of reactionary position, because as opposed to understanding that you being implicated now gives you the point to stand on to fully accept your implication and then decide to like do something about that. I think most people's response is to try to actually like disavow being implicated and try to escape the system and consume in a different way, which, you know, funny enough, capitalism is incredibly brilliant at this, and like the way that people market and advertise is incredibly, I think, clever, is that, oh, well, now we can just basically still keep you in the same system, but now we'll put you in this little niche category over here and we'll charge you 4 times the price. And then we'll like, you know, basically accrue even more profits because you now like have to consume in this ethical way. I think Zizek like really fundamentally changed my perspective on a lot of this stuff because of his, you know, I think really devastating criticism of how you're being sold an identity, like an ideological position, that you're basically like exchanging, you buy fair trade and pay 4 times the price, but the sort of return on your investment is a sort of lessening of that like deeply kind of like moral guilt that you feel about having to participate in it.
But I claim in today's capitalism more and more the tendency is to bring the 2 dimensions together in one and the same gesture, so that when you buy something, your anti-consumerist duty to do something for others, for environment and so on, is already included into it. If you think I'm exaggerating, you have them around the corner, walk into any Starbucks coffee, and you will see how they explicitly tell you, I quote their campaign, it's not just what you are buying, it's what you are buying into. And then they describe it to you. Listen, when you buy Starbucks, whether you realize it or not, you are buying into something bigger than a cup of coffee. You are buying into a coffee ethics. Through our Starbucks Shared Planet program, we purchase more fair trade coffee than any company in the world, ensuring that the farmers who grow the beans receive a fair price for their hard work. And we invest in and improve coffee growing practices and communities around the globe. It's a good coffee karma. And a little bit of the price of a cup of Starbucks coffee helps furnish the place with comfortable chairs and so on and so on. You see, this is what I call cultural capitalism at its purest. You don't just buy a coffee. You buy in the very consumerist act. You buy your redemption from being only a consumerist, you know. You do something for the environment, you do something to help starving children in Guatemala, you do something to restore the sense of community here, and so on and so on. This, and again, I could have go on, like the almost absurd example of this is so-called Tom's Shoes, an American company whose formula is 1 for 1. They claim for every pair of shoes you buy with them, they give a pair of shoes to some African nation and so on, so that you know, 1 for 1. One act of consumerism, but included in it, you pay for being redeemed of it, for doing something with environment and so on and so on. This generates almost a kind of a, how should I put it, semantic over-investment of burden, you know. It's not just buying a cup of coffee. It's at the same time, you fulfill a whole series of ethical duties and so on and so on. And again, this logic, I think, is today almost universalized. Like, let's be frank, when you go to a store, probably you prefer buying organic apples. Why? Look deep into yourself. I don't think you really believe that those half-rotten apples, which cost double the good old genetically modified apples that we all like, that they are really any better. I claim we are cynics there, skeptics, but you know, it makes you feel warm that I'm doing something for our Mother Earth, I'm doing something for our planet, and so on and so on. You get all that. So my point is that this very interesting short circuit where the very, as it were, act of egotist consumption and so on already includes the price for its opposite.
Right. It's something else that to go back to a point that I made earlier, it's something else that the subject who buys can put into the commodities which they buy.
Yeah.
A sense of identity, like I am an ethical consumer under the system of capitalism.
Yeah. And as we know, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. This is exactly why we say that. Yeah.
Right. That's what I was just going to say. All of the reasons that we're saying right now, if you ever wondered why there's no ethical consumption over capitalism, this right here, these last couple minutes are why that's not the case.
Yeah. So if you're wanting to help explain that to anyone, just, cut out those 2 minutes. We'll make a special little clip that'll just be for radicalizing your friends and family. And then you just send them that.
And then they'll all be totally radical. It'll be awesome. We'll get
goal.
To make a lot better movements on that, based on that.
I mean, hell, it would be a damn good start.
I would think so. Better than the starts we've had so far. Some of the starts that we've had so far. I don't know all of them. So
there are a lot.
Yeah, there are a lot. I'm not going to make blanket statements about them. So then the penchant for deception. Another thing that I think is a common argument, in addition to the I'll buy local argument, is the idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. That sort of came up. It's come up in a couple of your different episodes, and it came to mind as I was reading David Harvey's book here. And this falls under the idea of individualization as well. But the idea that the most highly rewarded people are the ones who are able to pull themselves up is, I think, it's an ideological function, not an objective reality of the way that things work. And it's one that's immediately revealed as false. Even the phrase itself, it tells you that it doesn't mean anything that's real. Martin Luther King Jr. in his book, Why We Can't Wait, has this really great line about the about the bootstraps line where he says something along the lines of, and I'm going to totally butcher it and feel like a piece of shit because I'm butchering such a great line. But he says something like, they want us to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps without realizing that the bootstraps are holding us to the ground. You can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not how bootstraps work.
Yeah, exactly. This is one of those weird like ideological distortions or sort of weird flukes of history where, you know, the way that something was initially used is in itself supposed to be very critical, and yet it gets adopted as like a very sort of positive, like generative way of talking about like a certain political context that you find yourself in. So, I mean, from what I remember, the history of like the idea of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps was a joke. It was a joke because it's impossible. But then it somehow gets warped in the American imagination under capitalism to say, oh, this is actually like this thing that valorizes like individual effort and hard work and grit. And it's like, you know, that was a joke. It was like, you didn't get the joke. You like did the opposite of it. I feel like this is exactly...
You had a total whoosh there.
Yeah, right? I mean, but this is also the case of things like talking about whether someone's politically correct or not. You know, the initial like birth of that phrase was a joke that like radical leftists made towards other people who were just like completely insane with like thinking you had to stick to one particular party line. It was a sarcastic criticism we would make about people, and now it's, you know... It's like used as if like that ever like meant something very serious, or it was like something that people actually like really invested in sincerely. Anyway, just the way these things happen are just always so mind blowing to me.
Yeah, but I think it's really important. I didn't realize that I was going to talk about this as we were doing this episode, but maybe it isn't that capitalism itself has begun this trend, but I do think it has benefited from it greatly, where the idea of history sort of being erased or forgotten about, and even as small ways as what words and phrases mean, has functioned to keep it pretty firmly in place. I don't play a whole lot of video games, but I do watch this video game review channel because the guy who does them is an absolute riot, and he makes a lot of cultural criticisms through video games. And one of the ways that he presents it is that as the console generations have gone on, they stopped being backwards compatible so that they could forget all of the things that they learned when they made games before, and they can remake those mistakes over and over and over again.
I love that. You might have to send me that channel. I kind of want to start watching that now. Okay, so I do have a question for you, just related back to the book itself and sort of this discussion that we're having. So the book is called Marx, Capital, and Madness, right? Or The Madness of Economic Reason. So I'm wondering, like, for you reading through this book, is this part of why Harvey talks about the logic of, or the economic reason of capitalism being madness? Is it part of like this sort of destruction of history, like the necessity of deception and how this affects us? Is this part of why that word gets used? I would say so. I would say that that's a really big part of it. The deceptive nature of it, I think, also makes it describable as madness. And the fact that it's totally contradictory, and also the contradictions are hidden, is another thing that just makes it total madness. The thing I think that separates capitalism, or one of the things that I think separates capitalism from a lot of other systems that I think would be better, is that those other systems sort of present their contradictions as being at the forefront. Or in my ideal way of thinking about them, they place those contradictions at the front of the way that they think about that system that they would want to have implemented. Whereas capitalism puts those things on the back burner. Like, it has to have them behind a veil. There is no contradiction in capitalism. So I'm curious, thinking at least hypothetically about another system putting the contradictions first. Like, what sort of examples do you think of whenever you would see a system, at least hypothetically, functioning where it doesn't have to like disavow or sort of veil its contradictions? Oh man, you're really putting me on the spot here. I'm asking you an incredibly hard question. Yeah. Oh boy, I'm gonna try my best to bring it down to a super small individual level, because that's gonna be the easiest way for me to think about it. So I had mentioned a little while ago that, or maybe it was more than a little while ago. Holy shit, where's the time gone? That one of the ways that I think about my role as a therapist, as an analyst, is resituating our position relative to the commodities that we consume, by resituating the fact that we find something that's going to fill up the lack, right? And I think that by presenting people with the contradiction that they want to have
that void filled, but never can have it filled, is, I think, a totally liberatory process. It's not that then you lay down and say, or throw your hands up and say, like, well, I guess I'll just die now, like whatever. That's not the point of what I'm trying to get at here. It's that now that you can see the chains that bind you, you can loosen them a little bit. It's not that these are my chains and so I might as well just fucking deal with them. It's now that I can see them, they were invisible. Now they're not. Now that I see them, what can I do about them? I probably can't get them off of me altogether, but that's not really the point. The chains being there is what makes it possible to loosen them in the first place.
Yeah, this also reminds me of the fact that I've been reading a lot of Mari Rudy since we're talking about analyst stuff, and as a preview, the next like Real Philosophy Hour series Alex and I are going to do on a Mari Rudy book that a patron recommended that is just already like absolutely phenomenal. But one of the ways that she conceptualizes sort of desire and drive that I think is actually very resonant with what you're saying is how, you know, whenever we actually see that we're like striving after these like impossible objects that can never like fully fulfill us in the way that like our fantasies, you know, sort of lead us to believe, in capitalism, you never get the chance to recognize the fantasy of it. Like it's always like you're deeply invested in the possibility that they really could do that. And one of the things I really love about how Rudy approaches this is that, you know, I read her as saying it isn't just that there's this sort of deep like tragedy of the fact that you can never be fully fulfilled, right? That you're always sort of existing in these chains. But those very chains or that experience isn't just a tragedy. It's also the thing that animates you and motivates you and like sort of like gives you movement as like a living, breathing being. There's a way that you can accept like the tragedy of that, but yet keep the contradiction like at the forefront. And if you were to do that, it would then allow you to maybe direct that in different ways, to sort of like move the train tracks to go in a different way versus having to go to the same station every single time. And I think that that's like a really interesting and radical gesture to me. And I'm wondering if like that kind of feels like how you're thinking about it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the opposite side of that, the way that a lot of people outside of the way that you and I are thinking about it right now, is to say that the focus should be on finding some sort of tool or some sort of mechanism by which we can unlock the chains that are, like, to continue with the metaphor, to unlock those chains, like as if there was any key that could possibly fit inside of that lock to undo it. And I think it's pretty obvious that there's not.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That key doesn't exist. It was thrown away a long time ago. It's gone.
And I could also see that a way to conceptualize what the madness of economic reason in capitalism is precisely the belief that there is a key. If we just produced the right thing and it did the right sort of things for you and it had the right sort of like bells and whistles and like the right sort of camera on your iPhone, like, oh, it would finally unlock those chains for you. But I think that that is, in its sense, like the total madness of this is that, yeah, like nothing can ever do that. And we can never just set back and acknowledge that fully, I think.
Something else that I find really interesting along those same lines is the way that it's I'm going to say infected, because I think it's a plague and it has that amount of seriousness, how it's infected the world of psychotherapy, the way that we treat patients that we see in clinics, because I know you do the same thing that I do here, where the point almost of doing therapy in the hegemonic idea is to give people coping skills. Like, who the fuck gives a shit about coping skills, honestly? I don't think I shouldn't put it that way. I think some people have probably gotten something useful out of that, but I don't think that it is anywhere near as useful as doing something different that has nothing to do with coping skills. You know, it's such a bullshit idea.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with this. I think that most therapy, in the way that you encounter it in the hegemonic form or how you learn it, is almost as if like you're just supplementing a lack of coping skills that people have. But that's really what you're doing at the end of the day. I mean, the complete radical potential of psychotherapy, at least in, you know, the kind of psychoanalytic sense, is like completely removed. It's like I would say it's not even like denied by most social workers I know of. It's like it's never even considered as like there's a different way to think about all this stuff. It's like you just accept that, oh yeah, like this is what you do as a therapist, is like you're just helping supplement people's, you know, lack. And I mean, and I think there probably is a lack for a good reason. Like I've mentioned on the show before, I worked with survivors of violence and trauma, right? And it's like, yeah, there are certain ways that deep, horrific form of trauma will like fundamentally like cut through you in a way that like will just be impossible to deal with, you know, without certain things that I think really can help you like actually address the sort of real radical potential of what therapy could be. But yeah, I mean, but the idea that like that's what most therapy is, I think is just like deeply irritating to me, like more and more every day now, especially like getting, like studying psychoanalysis for a while.
Yeah, no, it's the worst thing that could have happened. But I do want to make the point that it's really important that it did happen, because the function of the coping skill is that it can be measured. And that's one of David Harvey's big points in this book, is that capitalism has to disavow and ignore things that it can't directly and objectively take a measurement of. That's part of why psychoanalysis, I mean, it didn't really do itself a lot of favors historically, but one of the other reasons that it is not so popular in the United States and other countries is that since it can't be directly measured, it won't be reimbursed by insurance companies, and people have a conception of it that like, oh, since there's no objective way to measure it, then it's not worth my time. Like, you know what I'm trying to say? I
absolutely know what you're trying to say. This also reminds me of something that Max Weber, great sort of German sociologist, said about like what capitalism required to develop in Western Europe the way that it did. And one of the things he said that was an absolute fundamental necessity was the ability to take very objective, like accounting-based measurements of things, like to sort of, I think it was like double bookkeeping was the method. But the idea is that like you have to be able to sort of like measure and track things specifically for accounting purposes. If you didn't have that, like capitalism potentially like wouldn't have developed in the way that it did, because it has to have that sort of element of measurement to it.
And what I find really, really funny about that, maybe funny is the wrong word, really devastating about that whole point is that money as a representation of value is measuring something that can't be measured.
Yeah.
Labor is I think inherently unmeasurable. It's not some objective thing that we find in nature and you can slide a ruler across it and it tells you how much value is in it. David Harvey has this really great line where he says, I can't smash rocks and find atoms of gravity in them any more than I can, tear up a t-shirt and find atoms of value inside of it. It's not measuring something objectively present in reality.
That is such an awesome way to describe that. And that is also way easier to grasp than like Marx's first, couple of chapters of Capital about like exchange value and use value, and sort of, how you can sort of find some abstract symbolic sort of way to mediate between, a bale of hay and like two cows or something like that. I mean, whenever you read that, it's like, what the fuck is he talking about? But what you just described, that's what Marx is talking about. So if you've ever been baffled by that part of Capital, just know that was what he was talking about.
Yeah, he takes a long time to say things that could have been said in a much more succinctly, I think.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I think part of the reason I love Marx so much is I feel like I'm really terrible about that. I actually had my clinical supervisor like give me a ton of shit about it. And so it's like, I understand. It's pretty annoying sometimes. It's a weird pathological thing that we have. So, I think that's part of why I like Marx so much. Just I have like a weird thing too. It's probably not nearly as, intelligent or insightful, but at least, I can feel like we have the same symptoms. So, there's something to that. So.
That's cool. That's cool. You got something there with him.
Yeah.
Some link over the last several hundred years that,
exactly.
that connects the two of you.
Same
That's
weird,
awesome.
Annoying pathological symptoms. I'll take what I can get.
Yeah, no. And that annoying pathological symptom is what makes you the fact that it binds you in such a way that it does is what makes it possible for you to do any of the things that you've done so far, right?
That is such a beautiful psychoanalytic point. Just so everyone knows who's listening, you just heard psychoanalysis masterfully done right there.
Oh my God, no, you're too kind. I'm by no means a master of it, and I wouldn't want to be anyway.
Yeah, exactly. See, that was a trap, and luckily you didn't step into it, so you just demonstrated your mastery.
Thank God. Yeah. That means I can keep my psychoanalysis card in my wallet.
Yeah, exactly.
That's perfect. So I'll go ahead and start with Byung-Chul Han, because I know you were really interested in that in that point when I sent you over my notes. He has this piece that you and I talked about before we started recording called Burnout Society. That's another thing that if you're in quarantine and looking for something to read, this is an outstanding book. But he makes this point in that book that over time, we have moved from our subjectivity, the nature of our subjectivity has moved from being one that is dictated by obedience to one that is dictated by achievement. I'm going to try my best to break that down a little bit because it's been a little while since I read the book, but I think I remember the argument really well, and it's a very powerful point. The way that a manager used to function, if you worked in a factory, or it's not even in a factory, but in any job, was to tell you, like, these are the ways that you're fucking up. These are the ways that you're going to fix the ways in which you're fucking up. And if you don't do those things to fix the ways in which you're fucking up, then you won't have a job here anymore. And you either capitulated to that demand to fix those things, or you refused to do them and you quit or just got fired when you didn't do the things that you were asked to do. That has shifted over time to the point that the worker instead is responsible for achieving as much as they can. The focus has switched from being on these are the things that you have to do if you want to keep a job to these are the things that you should want to do in the first place. You should want to achieve more. You should want to be reaching for the stars and on, that type of stuff. And the psychic cost of that is that you become sort of your own warden. The way that the manager used to function in your brain was as this person that you could rail against and hate when you went to the bar after work with your coworkers. And now I don't think you have that in the same way. You're the person responsible for the fact that your job sucks in a lot of ways. You know what you know what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
that strikes me as just having real big Foucault energy as well, because I know Byung-Chul Han is like very influenced by Foucault, but that idea of we're internalizing sort of our own like discipline like into ourselves, and now it's something that's emerging like internally from us versus being imposed from the outside is a really like brutally effective and insidious method of control.
Yeah, absolutely. I have my gripes with Foucault, but I do think he was right on point with that idea. The cost of that is, I think, just immeasurable and totally violent. The way that you just put it is outstanding. It's not even violence that you get to direct at anybody else, because now the responsibility is yours. You are the person towards whom you are being violent.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever heard of William Davies? I mentioned him on the show before.
I've heard of him, but I'm not familiar with any work.
Yeah. So William Davies is, I mean, I would dare say in like my top 3 or 5 like favorite writers right now who like write anything about like politics and theory and from like a Marxist perspective. But one of the things that I really took from him is he has this really great description of how under neoliberalism we see these rises in like mental illness, like depression, anxiety, and everything else. And this actually goes back to us talking about hiding the source of surplus value and like the physical labor and the brutality of that. It does this really great study of how the more that labor in, like, let's say the UK or the US becomes more and more like service-based and intellectual labor and emotional labor, you see a corresponding decrease in physical injuries in the workplace, but a massive increase in like mental injuries. And so he sees things like depression and anxiety rates, and as those are exploding, is actually being an effect of violence being like dematerialized, but sort of placed in you as you're like becoming your own authoritarian boss. He sees that like depression and anxiety are sort of a corresponding response that we have because authority is internalized in us as subjects now. Yeah,
that's a really, really great point, that mental illnesses, mental diseases, and stuff like those things have been turned into, maybe even from the start they began this way, but have been reinforced as being totally individual, like a biochemistry brain disorder thing. And to some degree that's probably true, I think, but there's also a huge social component to the ways in which these difficulties arise in people, and the fact that brain chemistry plays a role in them doesn't tell you shit about where they came from.
Absolutely. Yeah, or what is it that's activating gene expression that allows for some people to then like produce neurotransmitters at like lower rates or whatever it is to like normal functioning. I mean, I was reading some studies on this, and I think even for things like depression and anxiety in the United States, at least, if you were to sort of control for like cause, like that, I think it's only like 15% or something of at least like diagnosable things like depression and anxiety, you could actually almost like not even like solely, but just heavily weight towards like genetics and sort of like neurochemistry and like neurobiology, that still, even if you control for all that shit, that the vast majority of most mental illness, at least for those sort of categories, is still like primarily socially sort of catalyzed, let's say.
Yeah, and one of the ways in which we see that becoming more prominent is because of this shift from the common or collective space to the individual space. I think that's very clear. I don't think there's any getting around that.
Yeah. And I think that Foucault is definitely still a pretty key thinker to engage with, just to understand like that shift and sort of the complexities of it, and like how it, I think, shows up in your day-to-day mental health. And it's the reason why we read all this theory shit, because it helps you understand like, fuck, why do I feel so anxious and depressed all the time? And it's like, theory has an answer for that depending on what theory you read, I think.
Yeah. And along this same vein, I think it's another probably Foucauldian point, but Mark Fisher in his book Capitalist Realism has this point about becoming the auditor of your own performance. I think it's along these exact same lines, where instead of going to a manager who says these are the ways that you're not doing your job correctly or as well as you could be, you're instead asked, I see this all the time where I work because I supervise people. The way that I'm asked to format it is, how do you think you're doing?
Yeah.
How would you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5?
Yeah.
And you can't rate yourself a 5. You have to rate yourself a 4, because there's always room for improvement. Like it's such a gigantic load of horseshit that it makes me want to die. And it's the cost of that is very similar to the movement from obedience to achievement, where you're asked to like flog yourself instead of being flogged by somebody else, which is, I think, just more psychically violent than having it be from an external body.
I think the other thing too here, that for me, I think sometimes whenever you start grappling with this stuff, it can feel very like idealistic, like not in the sense of like being really optimistic, but the idea that it's like ideal versus material. And I think that it's also important to recognize too that there is a very like material basis for why this is part of this new shift in subjectivity and like management and how capitalism has to function, because it's a hell of a lot more efficient for us to police ourselves than to have the state and bosses and like a police apparatus to physically incur violence upon you to discipline you. It's like, it's a much more efficient system if we all just police ourselves. I mean, it's way less work for people who actually like control these institutions of power.
Yeah. David Harvey makes this really great point in here at several different points, where he says that managerial and organizational and bureaucratic systems don't produce any value except insofar as they facilitate the increased speed, the increased efficiency of value creation. So even though managers aren't strictly speaking producing anything, they're paving the way for things to be produced at a higher, faster, more economically sensible rate.
Yeah, I mean, that is just like an earth-shattering point to think about, like why those management techniques like shift in the way that they do. This is sort of a little bit tangential, but it is something that you might find interesting. I think is pretty relevant. So there's a book by Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiaparello called The New Spirit of Capitalism. And I don't recommend everyone go read this book because it's very hard and it's really, really theoretically like complicated. But the basic argument that they make is that post-May 68 and into the 70s, that essentially part of the arising of these new sort of management techniques was essentially offering a trade-off to workers, basically, and usually white-collar workers, I think especially, but the trade-off was essentially, listen, you basically sort of accept these new management techniques that we're using where like you police yourself, it's about achievement instead of discipline and all this other stuff, but like part of the trade-off was, well, you're going to have more of a free sense of autonomy and freedom in your work. Like you're going to have this sort of illusion of like being much more in control of what you do. But what you get in exchange for that is security, dismantling of the social safety net, destruction of like retirement, like all the things that were supposed to protect us, like as, like part of the commons, right? It's like you basically you give away that sense of security as long as you can feel like you have less disciplinary control in your life. But the thing is like you're still controlled. It's just now internalized in this guise of freedom, which is even more insidious and hard to understand and break out of, I think.
Yeah, for sure. The illusion of freedom is, I think, totally endemic to the perpetuation of the capitalist system. Like, you have to think like that capitalism sets you free so that you don't ever try to actually do anything that would set you free,
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I mean, I think that seems like a pretty necessary, especially ideological feature of the system now for it to keep working, is that I think this is why it's so hard to I don't want to say like undermine or subvert, although I absolutely mean that. But I think this is one of the things that makes it so hard about talking to people who are like still like deeply invested in the capitalist system, because you're not just like making an argument that, oh, if you were just like much more like socialist or like communist, like you would have the things that you want, right? Like, why is it that you can't just tell anyone? Like, I can think about people from where I'm from, like, you can just be like, hey, listen, if you were like much more on board with these like more left-wing policies, you could have free medical care. And you wouldn't have to worry about all the bullshit and the stress and like the violence that this system does to your body and your mind. It's like, why is that so hard to understand? And I think part of it is because, well, it isn't just like getting what you want. It's the fact that you believe that this system grants you maximum freedom. And I think that that's the hardest fantasy to help break, is to understand that like you're actually not free in the way that you think you are. And I know this sounds like some Matrix 101 bullshit.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us, even now in this very room.
But I really think that is like a core part of our subjectivity as capitalist subjects, is that we believe that this system grants us as much freedom as possible. But I mean, I think it's our freedom to choose is usually a false choice, and that's a hard thing to grapple with, and it's a hard thing to feel like you have to let go of, I think.
Yeah, it's hard to grapple with, even more fundamentally than that, the idea that contradictions exist at all.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
That's a core disavowal that we have. I think even before capitalism, that contradiction is fundamental to our experience as humans, mm-hmm. in a world that we're not at one self-identified with. That is core, and that makes it extraordinarily difficult to overcome the fantasy that capitalism appears to set you free while tightening, the grip that it has around your throat.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's beautifully put, and it sort of also kind of lays out the great task that we have in front of us to want to actually, overthrow or like destroy capitalism, whatever that means. And also why it's so damn hard, and maybe why it hasn't happened yet, because, what we're up against is something incredibly complex and incredibly, I keep coming back to this, but incredibly effective at what it does, of perpetuating itself as a system. For sure.
Yeah. And, on that note, I want to make one more point before we wrap things up here.
Yeah.
I think a very popular mode of thinking about revolution to the capitalist system is the idea of accelerationism, the idea that, we just push as far into the capitalist, turn it up to 11, so mm-hmm. to speak, so that eventually we could reach very quickly reach the point where the whole thing crashes. And I don't think that that's the best revolutionary move to make here. Mm-hmm. Because as we brought up a couple different times, crisis is a part of capitalism that it needs to have. It views crisis as an opportunity to reset itself in a really fundamental way. So I think that the better counter to capitalism is a theme that you have brought up a lot of times on a lot of different episodes of dialectical pessimism. Mm-hmm. It's similar, but I think it's different and a much more complete revolutionary gesture than the idea of accelerationism.
Well, now I'm going to ask you to say more about that. So what do you see as being sort of the difference, or how that's like for you maybe a more complete revolutionary gesture?
Well, I think that accelerationism sort of has this idea that once you accelerate and bring about the end more quickly, that the end point entails some sort of inherent betterness, if that makes any sense. And I don't think that's the case. If you topple the entire capitalist system with nothing left in place, first of all, I think things would be really horrible. that would be not good. But also, it wouldn't erase the fact that contradiction is fundamental to human subjectivity. It doesn't do that. Acceleration does not. Accelerationism disavows the fact, I think, that the end point still has contradiction within it. Whereas dialectical pessimism, I don't think does that. I think it confronts the fact that contradiction is constitutive to our experience and grapples with it in a more constructive and productive way. To use the image of the chains that I've used before, I think accelerationism sort of wants to, oxidize the chains so that they rust and eventually fall off.
Yeah.
Without realizing that that's not going to happen before they die. I don't know. I'm making this up as I say it. Whereas dialectical pessimism is recognizing that there's no key and that the chains define any movement that you can make in the first place.
Yeah. And I almost wonder if the accelerationist view is still kind of deeply utopian and idealistic at its core, because it might sort of say, well, we're going to have to destroy everything and let's accelerate, with still the understanding that there is a point without contradiction, or once the system crashes, we can create the new system without the contradictions within it. And the idea would be that, you sort of kill the body of the patient to try to cure the disease, without understanding that's kind of the solution that you're offering. I really appreciate you sharing that, because that, I think, is something we're still doing on the show, right? We're trying to unpack and explore what a perspective that we're calling dialectical pessimism, what its implications are, what makes it different, and how I think for all of us, on all of our shows that we approach things this way, why we found ourselves coming to this as our sort of orientation towards politics and contradiction and subjectivity and freedom and all of this stuff. And for me, I guess I'm almost reminded of the episode that we did with Neil on Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, is because I think in some ways it's I definitely consider myself a utopian, but I consider myself a pessimistic utopian because of the idea that I don't think it's possible and not even desirable to ever seek for a utopian vision that doesn't have contradiction at the forefront, to come back to a way you described it, which I think is absolutely perfect. And in some ways accelerationism and also things fully automated luxury communism, they operate with that sort of idealist, non-contradictory sort of principle at their core, even though they never talk about it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's clearly operating there. I think in the way that I'm reading and hearing it be talked about, that's the way that I think it's presenting itself. And, if we ended up in a system like that where there was somehow no contradiction, if that were possible in the first place, that would be odd, I think. But if we ended up with a system like that, that would be a horrible, unexciting, uninteresting, totally bland way to exist.
Yeah.
There's a Disney movie, WALL-E. I'm saying that like it's some indie movie, but it's literally a Disney movie. So I don't know why I'm acting so pretentious about it. But they're up in space and they all live on this gigantic spaceship, and they're somehow able to do everything that they want to do. And they look and feel and act like shit when they're like, it's a totally horrible way to live their lives. And eventually they want to change it,
I'm wondering if you'd also say that part of the madness of economic reason under capital is, in the dream of and the fantasy of the commodity eventually satisfying you completely, it is also this utopian sort of nihilistic vision. Because if it were ever to do that, if you were ever to be fully satisfied in the way that the commodity or the fantasy of it offers, it would lead you to this WALL-E existence. Or I always think about The Immortals and Zardoz, which really is a weird niche film. It's also a horrible film. It's incredibly entertaining. But I think that that's what those visions in sci-fi or in film always kind of are portraying, is that if you were to have everything you wanted, it would actually be a hellscape of an experience for you. Because, again, those chains, Mari Rudy says, that I really love how she puts this. It's they do constrain us and restrict our subjectivity and what we experience in a certain way. And they're also incredibly generative and core. That's the real, that's the core feature of what allows us to not be completely collapsible into the social order, is the fact that like those chains somehow like create these weird incursions of something that is, you know, like what she calls like the immortal within, you know, that's that part of you that is like not human, but inhuman, you know, it's monstrous. And yet it's the thing that makes you what you are. And I think that that's kind of, you know, what we don't realize is that, and this is why I think analysis is so vital, especially if you're like a hardcore revolutionary Marxist or whatever, is because you have to understand how deep like our desire to have that utopian vision or that utopian world where we wouldn't have to deal with contradiction. And we have to like understand how that can be operating under the surface of like a sophisticated political sort of project like fully automated luxury communism or accelerationism. It's like, wait a minute, like underneath there still are these things, and we have to be very wary of what we're actually wanting to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it comes back to an earlier point that we made that David Harvey makes, that you can't emphasize one part of the revolution, one moment of the revolutionary gesture, because to do that would be to do the same thing. Because if you privilege one part of it and ignore the others, then it sort of disavows them and the role that they play in constructing a phantasmatic utopia, you know?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's an interesting point. And again, you know, I don't know if Harvey would think about it through an analytic lens, but damn if they don't work well together. No,
they really do. I think it's the parallels that they have are strangely clear. You wouldn't think that they had anything to do with one another, but here we are, and they complement each other extremely well. It's odd.
Comrade, on that note, how do you feel about maybe doing a quick wrap up, and maybe that is a good place to end? Do you feel like we've missed anything, or any last points you wanted to make sure we include for listeners?
The only other point that I want to make is that if you want to get a grasp on this without reading a book, watch the show Mad Men. Just do it. It's so worth your time. It makes so many of these points in a way that is interesting. And even though it's set in the 60s, it's still applicable to today. Like if you are in quarantine, I've said this like 5,000 times now, I feel like if you're in quarantine and looking for some way to spend your time and still get some sort of revolutionary or insightful point out of the time that you're spending doing stuff, and you're going to spend that time watching TV, watch Mad Men. Like it's outstanding. Just do it.
I'm actually really glad you said that, because I've been wanting to go back and rewatch it ever since listening to them talk about it on Y Theory, and I realized I'm probably going to start it tonight, and because I've watched it once all the way through, but I feel like I need to watch it now because of all the psychoanalytic shit that we're doing on the show.
Yeah, for sure. The way that they talk about it on that podcast is extraordinarily clear, and it makes a lot of really great points that I think are interesting to think about. And what I actually find most interesting about that episode of Y Theory is that they don't cover everything. So you can watch Mad Men and still come to different points or different conclusions on your own, even though it might have been supplemented by the way that they're thinking about it, you know?
Yeah. Anything else before we wrap up with a couple of real brief questions on your sort of own thoughts about the book?
No, I don't think so. I think I've made the points that I wanted to make.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like actually we got pretty much through the whole outline. That was fantastic. I feel like we could have just like gone off on any one of these points for like another hour and a half and been fine. So I always like to ask, you know, whenever we sort of get through a book on the show, to think about, you know, I feel like we probably talked a lot about what the big takeaways are. So I feel like that's going to be pretty obvious. I always think it's important too to think critically about the things that we're reading and not just sort of, you know, like accept everything as if, you know, there aren't like weaknesses or sort of gaps in it itself. So for you, I'm wondering what sort of maybe like points of critique or sort of like weaknesses in the text that you found, or like things that really struck you as, you know, you disagreed with, or maybe you thought they needed to be unpacked more.
Well, you know, I think the main thing missing from it, and from Marx's account, although Marx I'm willing to forgive for it a little bit more than David Harvey, is an account of the psychic nature of capitalism. The way that it plays inside of our minds is, I think, extraordinarily important. And Marx, I don't think, can be faulted for missing that, because that hadn't really entered discourse until a while after he was writing.
Yeah.
But I think David Harvey's account, and I don't think it was I don't think he intentionally left out the psychic cost that capitalism has on the capitalist subject. But I do think it's an important part of the consideration that is missing from his account, which is fine. He wasn't setting out to make an all-encompassing critique of capitalism that, pulls from economics and politics and psychology and biology, and all these other different fields. That wasn't his point, but I do think that that's a perspective that is missing from this account specifically.
Yeah, and that's why you should listen to our Capitalism Desire, the Psychic Cost of Free Markets reading series, which I do think is important, right? It's like, Harvey isn't presenting sort of like a unified theory and critique of capital in all its aspects. And that's why it's important to make sure you read like different approaches to critiquing capitalism so you get the full, you get some sort of like patchwork, like unified theory.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think a really important sub point to make based on that is that if you yourself as a reader don't have your own framework from which you are reading and analyzing a text, you're not going to get material out of it that is as useful as it could be if you did. I think that's another. I'm gonna go off on a tangent here for a second, but I think it's a worthwhile tangent, so bear with me. I think the shift has been towards being totally flexible in your skills and in your ideas and like blah 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 blah. And that's fine, but I think if that flexibility isn't based on some sort of rock solid foundation, then it is not really worth anything if you're flexible and don't have anything to which you are referring back. Mm-hmm. I remember having a conversation with a therapist at the place where I work. And, I'm interested in therapy, so I talked to people about it, and I said, what kind of therapy do you do? And she sort of waffled back and forth like, I'm just doing some sort of stuff. And then, I pressed her. I was like, no, I know about this type of stuff. You can use jargony words if you want. I'll try my best to follow you here. And she said, well, I do a little bit of CBT and a little bit of DBT. And I said, oh, okay. So when you talk CBT, are you talking Aaron Beck or are you talking Judith Beck? And she was like, I don't know. Who are those people? I was very taken aback by that. And, it just became clear to me that she was sort of and she even said it, like, the way that I do therapy is I just sort of see what's working and I keep on doing the stuff that's working. And I think that's a horrible way to approach. I was talking specifically about therapy, but I think it applies to reading a book like this as well. If you don't have a framework from which you are analyzing the text that you're reading, it's not going to be as worthwhile as if you do. Even if that framework isn't necessarily, like immediately clear how it's compatible, or if it's totally incompatible, that incompatibility sort of still functions to frame the way that you're thinking about the text that you're reading. It's still important.
That's beautifully said, and it's part of the reason why, you need to read a little bit of theory, or at least like make the attempt, because if you don't, like you're sort of just, I think, even more susceptible to sort of the social conditions and ideological functioning that you find yourself in, because there's no more effective ideology in the United States than I just put things together pragmatically and see what works. That in itself is hegemonic ideology under capitalism. So,
absolutely.
Comrade Jared, this has been an exhilarating and wonderful ride through David Harvey's book. What final thoughts do you want to leave listeners with? I don't know if you want to like plug anything. I know we talked about things at the beginning, but what do you want to leave off with today?
Sure. Well, if you're interested in psychoanalysis from a clinical perspective, then do listen to the Inform podcast that Comrade Neil and I do together bi-weekly. The other point that I want to make is to think through your idea of revolution, to think through your idea of what emancipation is, to really make sure, you mentioned at the beginning that if you're going to critique capitalism, you should understand capitalism. And if you're going to enact a revolution, then you should understand the implications.
I mean, shit. Yeah. Okay. I don't have anything else to add. That's good enough for me. So I do have one final question for you. Would you ever like to come back on and do another book?
Yeah, for sure, man. I'm down.
Okay, well,
I'll do a reading of pretty much anything that you want.
All right, so I'm gonna send you like Battlestar Galactica and philosophy, and then we'll do that together. Actually, we'd kind of be into doing that on the show at some point.
Sure, I'll have to watch Battlestar Galactica, but I'm down to try.
It's great. Everything but like the last season and a half or so is actually incredibly well done sci-fi, incredibly philosophical. The politics, all that stuff. Phenomenal show. Me and Comrade Commissar Don are big fans of it. But yeah, we'll talk some details. But I'd love to have you back on sometime.
Cool. Can't wait.
Well, I know we're all in the quarantine, but there are still things to do, and there's work to be done. So I guess I'll just leave you, Comrade Jared, and all of our comrade listeners across the globe by just saying thank you so much for doing this book. This was an incredible discussion, and I think just dovetails so well with all the other stuff that we're doing from a slightly different angle that's still very compatible. So I think this was the perfect thing to do in the midst of all the psychoanalytic work we're doing.
Cool. I'm glad I can be that bridge for you.
Zip it up and zip it out. That is a wrap for this week's Red Library. Big thanks, big shout out to Comrade Jared for reaching out, for coming on the show, for reading David Harvey's book and sharing it with me and the rest of all of you beautiful babies out there across the globe. Can't wait to have him back. You hear me, Comrade Jared? Hit me up. Let's do another book. I have some ideas. Remember to check out the Informed podcast that Comrade Jared does with our excellent Podrad Neil from 78 and our fellow Lost Horizons Network collaborator, conspirator, Comrade Commissar, all the different things that he is. That was a lot of alliteration. That's how I'm feeling today. That's what you're getting. Reminder that for most of you out there, unless you're already a patron, there is not going to be a free release episode next week as we take the last week off and just do our patron-only episode. But this month, we are going to release something very special. There's going to be a patron-only episode, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. But there's also going to be a little treat. It's like that Bernie meme, when cats can have a little salami. So that'll be dropping on our main show feed, so keep your eyes and ears peeled for that as well. And in the meantime, before we see you back here again next Sunday, and future Sundays, as long as Sundays exist, let's go out the way we always do. Stay hydrated. Stay motivated. Don't get liquidated. Search for ways to be emancipated. Stay strong, stay vigilant, stay thirsty, or hydrated. Whichever one. Either one is totally okay for the Red Library gang. Stay theoretically thirsty. Remember that in these dark times, for the dialectical pessimist, the only way out is through. We're trying to do that here, and we hope you're going to follow along with us, at least in spirit. Just remember, as always, especially during these times of social isolation, whenever our psyches can break down, whenever our sense of hope can break down, and it feels that that utopian horizon is receding further and further away, that we out here, comrades. Red Library, your crew, we out here. We'll see you next time. Peace.